The morning of March the 2nd, 1943, broke bright and clear over the Bismarck Sea. 500 miles from the nearest Allied airfield, a Japanese convoy was cutting through Pacific waters toward Lae. 12 vessels in formation, 8 transport ships heavy with supplies and men, 4 destroyers positioned to guard them, bristling with anti-aircraft guns layered in defensive rings. The Japanese commanders moving through these waters possessed absolute certainty in their strategy. American bombers, they knew, always came from high altitude, predictable and vulnerable to coordinated gunfire. Vice Admiral Janichi Kusaka stood commanding this convoy with complete confidence. His fleet had traveled this route many times before. The pattern was familiar, the defenses reliable. High-altitude bombers were slow. They were easy to track on radar. They were easy to shoot down when your anti-aircraft crews trained together and fired as one coordinated unit. But then the radio crackled with reports that simply didn't fit the expected picture. American B-25s were coming in at 50 feet above the water. They were moving at 230 miles per hour. They were skimming across the ocean surface like flat stones thrown by a giant hand. The Japanese had never encountered anything remotely like this. The flat guns positioned all across the convoy couldn't angle down far enough to target aircraft flying that low. The radar systems designed to detect aircraft at altitude couldn't pick up machines hugging the wave tops. Within 2 days, every single transport ship would rest on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Nearly 3,000 Japanese sailors would lose their lives to tactics so unconventional that the Imperial Navy at first refused to believe the reports were even true. 2 days earlier, at Port Moresby's airfield, Lieutenant Colonel John Hap Arnold had stood before a packed briefing room. Harsh fluorescent lights washed his weathered face in a ghostly glow. Maps of the Bismarck Sea covered every wall space, marked with shipping lanes, enemy positions, and those dreaded red circles denoting Japanese strongholds where resistance would be fierce. The assembled pilots, American and Australian both, shifted in their metal folding chairs. Cold coffee sat in cups growing neglected in their hands. They assumed this would be another routine assignment, another high-altitude bombing run following the same procedures they'd executed dozens of times. When Arnold's voice cut through the humid, heavy air, his tone carried an edge that made every man in the room straighten and lean forward. "Gentlemen, intelligence reports indicate a Japanese convoy departing Rabaul tomorrow morning, 12 ships total, 8 transports loaded with troops and supplies destined for Lae, escorted by 4 destroyers. Standard formation, standard route, standard defenses." He let the word standard linger in the air, like cigarette smoke dissipating slowly. "But we're not going to use standard tactics," he continued. "We're going to do something the Japanese have never seen before. Something they won't expect and won't believe until it's too late." Captain Eugene Red Sledge from the 43rd Bomb Group raised his hand carefully. "Sir, are we talking about the usual approach? The B-17s leading in formation, scatter pattern, medium bombers following up?" Arnold's smile was thin and dangerous. "No, Captain, we're going in low and tight, 50 feet above the waves." The room erupted in murmurs and shifting bodies. Group Captain Geoffrey MacDonald of the Royal Australian Air Force leaned back in his chair, his eyebrows climbing upward with skepticism. MacDonald had flown more combat missions across the Pacific than any other pilot present, and his face carried the weight of that hard experience. "Sir, with respect, anti-aircraft guns at that altitude would destroy us. Those destroyers carry 20 and 40mm guns both. At 50 feet, we'd be completely exposed targets." Arnold nodded, accepting the concern without dismissing it. "That's exactly what they're counting on, Mac. Their entire defensive strategy assumes bombers come from above. Their guns are calibrated for high-altitude targets. Their radar systems are designed to track aircraft at 10,000 feet or higher. Their gunners train for targets they can see coming from miles away." He tapped the map with his knuckle. "But what happens when we appear under their radar? What happens when we're on top of them before they can even react?" The silence deepened. These weren't inexperienced soldiers. Every man in the room had faced Japanese anti-aircraft fire directly. Every man had watched friends get shot down by the brutal accuracy of enemy gunners. Flying straight into those teeth, Seemed like suicide with unnecessary complications. Sledge cleared his throat. Sir, the B-25s aren't really designed for skip bombing. The bomb release mechanisms, the flight characteristics at that altitude, the strain on the airframe. We're modifying them, Arnold interrupted. We're adding extra forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. We're fusing the bombs for delayed detonation. The B-25s will go in first, strafing the decks to suppress the gun crews. Then they'll drop their ordnance to skip across the water and detonate against the hulls below the waterline. The fighters will follow immediately behind, taking out any gun positions that survive the first pass. MacDonald studied the tactical diagram Arnold had sketched on the blackboard. The precision required would be extraordinary. The timing would have to be perfect. One mistake, one aircraft out of sequence, and the entire formation would get caught in a crossfire they couldn't escape. Which is why we're drilling this until you can execute it in your sleep, Arnold said. But think about what we're really doing here, gentlemen. For 2 years, the Japanese have controlled these shipping lanes because they know exactly how we fight. They position their guns, they coordinate their defenses, they move their convoys based on the assumption that American bombers are predictable. His voice carried an intensity that had earned him his reputation as a genuine innovator. But what if we're not predictable? What if we throw out every manual they expect us to follow and hit them where they least expect it? A young Australian pilot near the back raised his hand. Sir, what about our own losses? Flying that low at that speed with virtually no room for evasive maneuvers. Arnold's expression softened. I won't lie to you. This is dangerous, more dangerous than almost anything most of you have flown before. But consider the alternative. If this convoy reaches Lae, those 8 transports will unload enough men and material to hold that port for another 6 months. How many Allied lives would that cost? How many more convoys will we have to face if we don't cut off this supply line right now? The room fell completely quiet as each pilot worked through the implications. They had all studied intelligence reports about Japanese reinforcements. They had all watched enemy positions grow stronger with each successful convoy operation. Traditional high-altitude bombing might damage a ship, but it rarely achieved the decisive results needed to truly disrupt enemy operations. MacDonald broke the silence. What's the weather forecast looking like? Clear skies, light winds from the southeast, Arnold replied. Perfect visibility. Which works both ways. They'll see us coming, but we'll have absolutely clear sight lines for the attack runs. And if this works, it'll be fast. If we actually pull this off, Arnold continued, his smile genuine this time, completely transforming his weathered features, we'll have just written a new chapter in the manual. Low-altitude precision bombing against naval targets. Skip bombing techniques that can deliver ordnance exactly where it needs to go. Coordinated strafing, runs that neutralize defensive positions before they can respond. He scanned the faces of the assembled airmen, and maybe, just maybe, will prove that American ingenuity and Australian courage can overcome Japanese firepower. The pilots began discussing among themselves, calculating risks, weighing this audacious plan against everything they had been taught about aerial combat. Arnold watched the transformation happen, saw the moment's skepticism began shifting into something resembling enthusiasm. Questions? He asked finally. MacDonald stood, his chair scraped against the concrete floor. Just one, sir. When do we start training? 8 massive transport vessels moved through the water in 2 neat columns. Their holds sat heavy with cargo bound for Lae. 4 destroyers took up protective positions around them. 2 led the way ahead, 1 guarding each side. The crews manning their anti-aircraft guns showed the kind of tired efficiency that came from months of escort work. Kusaka lifted his binoculars and allowed himself a satisfied smile. The formation looked perfect. This was exactly how Imperial Navy doctrine said a convoy should move. Each transport kept just the right distance from its neighbors, small enough to avoid giving bombers an easy target, while the destroyers' guns could cover the approach from any direction where the Americans typically attacked. His gun crews had trained over and over on how American bombers behaved. B-17 flying fortresses would come in high, maybe 20,000 feet, with medium bombers following below at 15,000. The radar would spot them. The anti-aircraft crews would coordinate their fire. At 0800 hours, the radar screens lit up. Enemy aircraft bearing 090, range 50 kilometers, altitude 20,000 feet, the radar operator reported in a steady voice. Kusaka nodded with approval. Right on time, right at the altitude he expected. Americans were nothing if not predictable. The B-17s from Captain Sledge's formation appeared first as tiny specks against the blue sky. White contrails marked their path like chalk lines drawn across the horizon. Through his binoculars, Kusaka watched the heavy bombers line up for their bombing run, staying well above where his lighter guns could reach them. The anti-aircraft crews opened fire with practiced rhythm, punching shells into the sky. Dark blossoms of flak appeared around the approaching aircraft, spreading like deadly flowers. The bombing run went exactly as Kusaka had foreseen. The B-17s dropped their loads from high up, and bombs began their tumble toward the convoy below, scattering across a wide area as high-altitude drops always did. Most of them missed completely, splashing into the ocean far from any ship, throwing up massive columns of water that drenched the nearest vessels but did no real harm. One transport caught a glancing blow on its upper structure and caught fire, but the damaged crews put it out quickly. Kusaka allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The formation stayed tight. His gunners performed well. The American attack accomplished almost nothing. Then the radar operator's voice cut through all the bridge noise with a tone that made Kusaka's stomach tighten. "Sir, multiple contacts bearing 180. Altitude unknown. They're too low for accurate tracking." Kusaka spun his binoculars around, searching the southern horizon. What he saw made no sense. B-25 Mitchell bombers were racing straight at his convoy, flying at a height that seemed impossible. They skimmed just 50 feet above the water, engines roaring as they pushed through the humid air at full throttle. Kusaka's mind struggled to understand what his eyes were seeing. American medium bombers did not attack ships this way. This violated every rule of aerial combat he had learned. No pilot in his right mind would fly at 50 feet above the ocean. No room to maneuver, no altitude to convert to speed if something went wrong. No safety margin at all. All guns engaged low-flying targets. Kusaka barked into his communication system. But even as he gave the order, he understood the terrible problem. The 20mm and 40mm guns on his destroyers were aimed and adjusted for targets high up in the sky. They could barely point low enough to hit aircraft below 500 feet, and the Mitchells were moving too fast to track easily. The lead B-25 opened fire with its forward machine guns from 2,000 yards out. Heavy bullets raked across the nearest transport's deck, cutting down Japanese sailors and silencing gun positions before they could even fire back. The bomber's bay doors hung open as it roared over the transport at 230 miles per hour, releasing a single 500-pound bomb that bounced across the water like a stone skipped by a giant's hand. The bomb struck the transport's hull below the waterline with a metallic ring, then silence for a heartbeat. Nothing seemed to happen. Then the explosion tore open the ship's inside, ripping a huge hole and flooding 3 compartments within seconds. The transport started listing right away, her captain shouting orders to damage control teams who had never trained for this kind of attack. More Mitchells followed one after another, each coming in at the same terrifying height, each dropping its bomb with deadly accuracy. The Japanese gunners, trained to track aircraft moving in predictable paths thousands of feet above them, found themselves helpless. The bombers appeared and vanished in seconds, flying so low that shooting at them risked hitting their own ships. A second transport took 2 direct hits in the middle, the skip bombing working brutally well against the thin plating below the armor. The ship's fuel and ammunition cargo caught fire in secondary explosions that sent columns of flame and black smoke climbing into the clear morning. On his flagship's bridge, Kusaka watched in horror as the perfectly arranged convoy defense fell apart under tactics no Japanese officer had ever considered. Radio calls came in from panicked ship commanders. Transport 3 is taking water, requesting assistance. Destroyer Asashimo reports guns inoperable, deck crew casualties increasing, enemy aircraft continuing attacks, unable to establish effective defensive fire. But the Americans had more coming. As the last Mitchells finished their runs and started climbing away, a new formation appeared on the horizon. Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters, their twin engines roaring, closing the distance at maximum speed. No bombs hung under these aircraft, but their noses bristled with 20mm cannons and 50-caliber machine guns, weapons built for tearing apart ground targets. Group Captain Geoffrey MacDonald led his fighters in a coordinated strafing attack that systematically destroyed every working gun position on the surviving Japanese ships. The twin-engine fighters made repeated passes at deck level. Their concentrated firepower cut down the gun crews and silenced the last organized resistance. Within 30 minutes of that first radar contact, 5 of Kusaka's 8 transports were either sinking or dead in the water. Their vital cargo bound for Lair's docks would rest instead on the ocean floor. The admiral stood frozen on his bridge, watching 2 years of careful planning collapse into chaos under tactics so unconventional that his own training had become a disadvantage. The destruction from the first attack hadn't even settled when Lieutenant Colonel Arnold's voice crackled through the radio, coordinating the second phase of what was becoming the most devastating aerial assault on a naval convoy in Pacific theater history. All units, this is control. Enemy formation scattered and disorganized. Continue attacks on designated targets. Repeat, continue attacks until every transport is neutralized. The Japanese convoy, once a model of naval discipline, now looked like a floating graveyard spread across 12 square miles of increasingly oil-slicked ocean. 3 transports had already sunk, their hulls torn open by the revolutionary skip bombing that Admiral Kusaka's defensive strategy had never imagined possible. 2 more listed heavily, crews desperately fighting flooding while preparing lifeboats for an evacuation that seemed more certain by the minute. Yet the Allied air assault wasn't finished. A second wave of B-25 Mitchells appeared from the northeast, their pilots having watched the first attack succeed and adjusted accordingly. These bombers came in even lower than the first group, some flying so close the spray kicked up from their propellers hit the wave tops. The Japanese gunners who survived the initial assault faced an impossible situation. Aircraft too fast to track, flying too low for weapons to reach, approaching from angles where nothing could be aimed effectively. Captain Sledge circled high above the destruction in his B-17, coordinating the continuing assaults with the calm precision that had earned him respect in the 5th Air Force. Mitchell Formation Baker, target the transport at grid reference 77 Alpha. She's still moving and could reach shallow water if we don't stop her now. His steady voice masked the revolutionary nature of what they were accomplishing. Complete destruction of a heavily defended convoy using tactics that military doctrine said were impossible. The targeted transport, her superstructure already torn by strafing, had increased speed in a desperate bid to escape. Her captain, veteran of 2 years of convoy duty, had never faced an enemy that attacked from wave height, and his evasive turns made no difference against bombers adjusting in real time. The assigned Mitchell came in from the port quarter, the pilot lining up a skip bombing run with the calm professionalism of routine practice. The 500-pound bomb hit the water 60 yards short, skipped twice across the surface with perfect precision, and slammed into the hull just forward of the engine room. The delayed fuse let the bomb travel deep inside before detonating. The explosion that followed sent a shockwave through the water that every ship in the convoy felt. The transport's back broke with an audible crack, and she began settling by the stern as her engine space flooded completely. Group Captain MacDonald's Bow fighters regrouped for a systematic suppression campaign that eliminated any possibility of organized resistance from the surviving ships. The twin-engine fighters worked in coordinated pairs, making repeated strafing runs that methodically destroyed every visible gun position, every radio antenna, every piece of equipment that could help defend the convoy. Their 20mm cannons and 50-caliber machine guns turned the decks into charnel houses, cutting down the gun crews and leaving the vessels helpless against the continuing bomber attacks. Beaufighter leader to control, all enemy gun positions on Transport 7 are neutralized, proceeding to designated targets 8 and 9. MacDonald's voice carried professional satisfaction through the radio. The Australian squadron leader had flown combat across 3 war theatres, but he had never seen defensive fire collapse so completely or so fast. Japanese crews trained to engage high-altitude bombers with coordinated barrages found themselves defenseless against an attack profile their own doctrine said was impossible. Admiral Kusaka, watching the systematic destruction from his flagship destroyer's bridge, realized with growing horror that the Americans hadn't simply changed their tactics. They had revolutionized them. The low-altitude approach eliminated early radar warning, compressed engagement time from minutes to seconds, and made his carefully planned defensive arrangements completely useless. His gunners couldn't depress their weapons enough to hit the attacking aircraft. His radar operators couldn't track targets flying below detection threshold, and formation discipline had dissolved into chaos as individual captains fought desperately to save their ships. The third wave of Allied aircraft arrived with precision timing, showing coordination that spoke to hours of careful planning. A-20 Havocs joined the assault, their twin engines driving them through smoke and spray at speeds that turned them into blurs. These aircraft carried fragmentation bombs and incendiary rounds, weapons chosen to maximize damage against personnel and equipment. One A-20, piloted by a young American whose name never made the official records, made a strafing pass across destroyer Asashimo's deck that killed or wounded every bridge crew member in a single run. The warship, suddenly without effective command, began steaming in erratic circles as junior officers tried establishing control under continuous air attack. Her anti-aircraft guns stood unmanned and useless, pointing at the sky, while bomber after bomber passed overhead unopposed. The systematic nature became clear as the attack entered its second hour. The Allied crews weren't bombing random targets, they were executing a carefully planned operation that prioritized complete elimination of Japanese transport capacity. Every transport showing signs of remaining seaworthy faced repeated bombing runs until she either sank or was so badly damaged that evacuation became the crew's only option. The destroyers, despite superior armament and armor, proved equally helpless against aircraft approaching from any angle at altitudes that made their weapons useless. By noon, the Bismarck Sea had become a monument to the obsolescence of traditional naval defense. 8 Japanese transports and their cargo of reinforcements bound for lay on the ocean floor or were in the final stages of sinking. The 4 escort destroyers, though more resistant to bombing, had been so thoroughly suppressed by strafing that they posed no further threat to Allied operations. Over 2,900 Japanese sailors and soldiers had given their lives in an engagement that spanned fewer than 4 hours. They fell as victims of something entirely new in the skies, an aerial technique their own training and established procedures had left them powerless to oppose. Allied pilots reported their findings across radio channels, their voices tinged with disbelief at what they'd accomplished. "Control, this is Mitchell 7. No remaining targets showing signs of life. Repeat, all assigned targets appear neutralized." The measured language of military communications couldn't possibly convey the revolutionary weight of what had just transpired. For the first time, a major enemy convoy had been completely obliterated using low-altitude precision bombing methods that would forever alter how naval combat unfolded across the Pacific. When evening descended on Port Moresby's operations center, a profound silence filled the spaces between celebrating voices. Lieutenant Colonel Arnold stood before the same tactical maps that had covered the briefing room walls just 72 hours earlier. The red circles marking Japanese positions seemed diminished now, less threatening, less permanent. Intelligence reports flowing in from reconnaissance missions painted a picture that had seemed impossible mere hours before. The total destruction of a major enemy convoy through techniques every military manual had branded as suicidal. Captain Eugene Sledge walked into the operations center with measured steps, a man aware he'd witnessed history unfold. His meticulously detailed after-action report documented what would stand as the most triumphant anti-shipping operation in Pacific theater history. "Sir, final damage assessment confirms 12 enemy vessels destroyed or rendered inoperable. 8 transports, 4 destroyers. Estimated enemy casualties exceed 2,900 personnel." Arnold listened to the figures, still wrestling with their magnitude. "Allied losses?" Sledge paused before answering. 3 aircraft damaged, No personnel casualties. Arnold absorbed these numbers slowly. They would reshape American air doctrine for every remaining year of the war. The Bismarck Sea attack had irrefutably proven that conventional wisdom about aerial warfare wasn't merely incorrect, it was dangerously, catastrophically outdated. The Japanese Navy's defensive preparations, refined across 2 decades of tactical study and methodical development, had become completely useless against American willingness to abandon tradition and pursue radical innovation. As the sun descended along the New Guinea coastline, Group Captain MacDonald appeared at the Operation Center, his flight suit still bearing cordite stains and salt spray from the day's intense operations. The Australian officer carried himself with the composed confidence of a professional who'd executed a flawless mission, yet his eyes reflected a deeper understanding of what they'd genuinely accomplished. "Reconnaissance confirms it, sir. Nothing but debris and oil slicks scattered across the water. The Japanese garrison at Lae will receive no reinforcements, no supplies, no ammunition. They're completely isolated." The ramifications extended well beyond destroying a single convoy. Intelligence work suggested that Japanese high command remained mystified about how such a heavily fortified formation could be eliminated with such speed and completeness. Radio intercepts showed confusion spreading through enemy commanders who'd constructed their entire defensive strategy around the assumption that American bombers operated from predictable altitudes using conventional methods. The low-altitude attacks hadn't merely sunk ships. They'd fundamentally shattered core assumptions about naval warfare that had directed Japanese planning since the Pacific War began. Arnold moved toward the window overlooking the airfield where ground crews were already preparing aircraft for follow-up operations. The B-25 Mitchells that had led the assault sat on the tarmac like resting predators, their modifications for skip bombing and low-level strafing representing an entirely new category of aerial weapon. "Gentlemen, what we've accomplished here transcends a simple tactical victory. We've demonstrated that American industrial strength can manufacture not merely more aircraft, but superior tactics, more effective approaches to challenges that conventional thinking couldn't possibly solve." The future possibilities were staggering. Every Japanese convoy route throughout the Pacific now faced exposure to attacks that could approach beneath radar detection, strike with pinpoint precision, and withdraw before defenders could respond. The low-altitude bombing innovations pioneered across the Bismarck Sea would be refined, standardized, and deployed throughout the theater as established procedure. What had started as an experimental attempt by visionary airmen had transformed into a new doctrine that would shape aerial warfare for generations. Rear Admiral Richard McNamara walked into the Operations Center carrying dispatches from Pacific Fleet headquarters confirming what everyone already sensed. The attack had surpassed all expectations and accomplished objectives that traditional high-altitude bombing could never reach. "Admiral Halsey sends his congratulations and his orders," McNamara announced with evident satisfaction. "We're to begin immediate planning for comparable operations against every significant Japanese convoy route between Rabaul and the Solomon Islands. The Navy wants this technique deployed throughout the fleet within 60 days. The speed with which senior command embraced these revolutionary tactics reflected a broader shift in American military thinking that transcended the Pacific entirely. For 3 years, Allied forces had contended against enemies commanding geographical advantages, protected supply routes, and defensive positions that appeared impossible to penetrate. The Bismarck Sea operation had established that technological innovation merged with tactical adaptability could overcome even meticulously prepared enemy defenses. This lesson would be applied not merely to naval operations, but to ground support missions, strategic bombing campaigns, and close air support techniques that would characterize Allied air power through war's end. Sledge examined reconnaissance photographs documenting Admiral Kosaka's convoy's complete annihilation, images destined to become textbook examples in military academies across generations. "Sir, intercepted Japanese radio traffic indicates they still don't comprehend our methods. Their after-action reports describe impossible American tactics and suicidal bombing runs that somehow succeeded. They're suggesting modifications to convoy escort procedures, but their proposals won't address the fundamental issue. He paused deliberately. They still assume we'll attack from altitude. The psychological consequences rippled far beyond immediate tactical achievement. Japanese naval commanders who'd organized convoy operations with assured confidence, grounded in established defensive measures, now confronted the terrifying reality that American air power could strike from unexpected directions with devastating precision. The certainty guiding Imperial Navy convoy planning had been displaced by uncertainty and bewilderment affecting every subsequent operation. Arnold reviewed final casualty tallies, reflecting on broader meaning. Nearly 2,900 Japanese personnel had perished not because of superior Allied firepower or overwhelming numerical strength, but through original thinking, challenging fundamental assumptions about aerial combat methodology. The attack had proven that in modern warfare, the side willing to discard conventional approaches and embrace revolutionary tactics gains decisive advantages over enemies constrained by tradition. The operation's success would permeate every dimension of American military strategy. Training programs would be redesigned, emphasizing low-altitude techniques. Aircraft would be reconfigured to maximize wave height performance, and tactical doctrine would be reformed incorporating Bismarck Sea lessons. What began as experimental work by innovative airmen would become standard practice for Allied air forces across the Pacific. Within days, Port Moresby's Operations Center hummed with planning for subsequent missions, applying fresh tactics to targets throughout Japan's defensive structure. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had concluded, but the revolution in aerial warfare it represented was merely commencing. By demonstrating that established doctrine could be revolutionized through creative thinking and deliberate risk acceptance, Arnold's airmen had fundamentally transformed air-sea combat and shown that American innovation could overcome any enemy advantage. The doctrine transformation commenced within hours following final Bismarck Sea reconnaissance reports, though its most substantial influence wouldn't emerge for decades. At the Pentagon, analysts examined tactical reports with scholarly intensity, treating them as revolutionary discovery. The absolute destruction of Admiral Kusaka's convoy through techniques contradicting every established aerial warfare principle had demolished assumptions directing military planning at the highest governmental echelons. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, summoned an emergency senior staff meeting 72 hours after receiving initial reports. The headquarters conference room filled with officers whose professional legacies rested on mastering high-altitude strategic bombing complexities, individuals now encountering the discomforting recognition that their expertise might be rendered obsolete. "Gentlemen," the general began, his voice bearing institutional transformation's weight, "what occurred over the Bismarck Sea changes everything we understood about air-sea combat. The tactical innovation spearheaded by Lieutenant Colonel Arnold's visionary airmen was propagating throughout the Pacific theater like wildfire consuming parched landscape. Air bases from Australia northward to Alaska started incorporating low-altitude techniques developed through desperate experimentation mere days earlier. Aircraft manufacturers received urgent modifications requests. Performance optimization at wave height, supplementary armor shielding against small arms projectiles, refined bomb release systems for skip bombing, strengthened forward-facing weapons for strafing operations. Yet implications transcended tactical adjustments. Japanese radio communications analysis revealed confusion and demoralization levels, suggesting enemy defensive preparation had been fundamentally compromised. Intercepted messages from Imperial Navy headquarters characterized impossible American tactics and supernatural teamwork, indicating Japanese commanders were struggling to conceive countermeasures against insufficiently understood attacks. Captain Sledge traveled to Washington for 3-day debriefings, addressing every operational element. Pentagon strategists wanted understanding not merely of attack success, but why traditional doctrine had catastrophically failed anticipating low-altitude bombing potential. The Japanese prepared for the war they anticipated fighting, Sledge explained to medal-decorated senior officers representing conventional military thinking's decades. They positioned their guns, trained their crews, and arranged defenses assuming our bombers would attack from predictable altitudes using established procedures. Intelligence reports documented cascade effects from convoy destruction spreading throughout Japan's defensive perimeter. The Leh garrison, severed from reinforcement and resupply, demonstrated deterioration, eventually forcing evacuation. Other Japanese strongholds, depending on regular convoy operations, found themselves progressively isolated, as Imperial Navy commanders hesitated committing ships to routes vulnerable to devastating American innovations. Group Captain MacDonald's comprehensive after-action report became mandatory study at Allied staff colleges. Its clinical analysis of coordinated low-altitude attacks, establishing foundations for tactical manuals guiding war's remainder. The Australian officers' systematic documentation of fighter strafing, run systematically neutralizing Japanese defensive capabilities, offered templates applicable to Pacific theater targets broadly. The psychological toll on Japanese naval leadership matched material destruction importance. Admiral Kusaka, rescued from his sinking flagship by one of few surviving destroyers, conducted an inquiry struggling to comprehend such heavily defended convoy elimination. Intercepted ultra-intelligence decryption later revealed his testimony's confusion depth regarding American capabilities. The enemy aircraft approached at altitudes preventing interception and employed bombing techniques our defensive doctrine never contemplated, Kusaka reported to superiors. Our anti-aircraft guns couldn't depress sufficiently for mast-height targets, and assault run speed prevented coordinated defensive action. Within half-year, Bismarck Sea innovations were systematized into standard procedures, transforming Allied air power throughout the Pacific. The 5th Air Force retrained all medium bomber crews in skip bombing techniques, while manufacturers produced specialized ordnance for low-altitude naval attacks. The desperate experiment had evolved into comprehensive doctrine, influencing military aviation for decades ahead. Ripple consequences extended beyond immediate tactical applications. American industrial capacity, already strained meeting global warfare demands, adapted with remarkable velocity, producing aircraft optimized for new techniques. Factory lines previously concentrating on high-altitude bombers incorporated low-level operation modifications. Supplementary armor, specialized bomb bay designs, heightened forward armament. Rapid revolutionary implementation demonstrated flexibility. Enemy forces constrained by inflexible doctrine and restricted production capacity couldn't replicate. Allied Air Force training programs incorporated Bismarck Sea lessons, with pilots learning from instructors simultaneously studying themselves. Flight schools from Texas to Australia emphasized low-altitude navigation, skip bombing accuracy, and split-second timing required for coordinated defended target attacks. The airmen fighting final Pacific War battles learned their profession using tactical manuals written by men, proving conventional wisdom wasn't just incorrect, but ruinously obsolete. Intelligence analysts tracking Japanese convoy operations declined throughout the theater recognized extended implications. Enemy shipping losses, already severe from submarine warfare, accelerated dramatically as low-altitude bombing rendered even escorted convoys vulnerable to devastating aerial strikes. The Imperial Navy's logistics structure, painstakingly constructed sustaining isolated garrisons across thousands of ocean miles, began collapsing under attacks approaching undetected and striking with precision never achieved through high-altitude operations. Military historians years later identified the Bismarck Sea as American air power's moment, fully realizing maritime operation domination potential. The tactical revolution, beginning with Arnold's doctrine challenge, had matured into comprehensive aerial warfare transformation, influencing aircraft design to pilot training everything. The 12 Japanese ships sinking across 48 March 1943 hours represented more than tactical triumph. They signaled American air superiority's commencement, defining Pacific War's remainder. Port Moresby's post-attack quiet satisfaction reflected professional accomplishment and deeper recognition that innovation and adaptability proved more decisive than numerical superiority or technological edge. Demonstrating established doctrine's revolutionary potential through creative thinking and calculated risk acceptance. Kusaka's convoy attackers showed principles guiding American military effectiveness long after World War II's final shots.